I've covered a lot of disturbing cases on this channel, but some cases stay with you differently. Cases where an entire family, spanning multiple generations, committed crimes so disturbing that even investigators struggled to process what they'd found. Cases that make you question how evil like this can exist anywhere. The Goler Clan is one of those cases. In 1984, a 14-year-old girl broke down in a school bathroom in Nova Scotia, Canada, and told her teacher something that would expose over a century of hidden horror. What happened in that isolated family wasn't just abuse, it was systematic. It was multi-generational, and it involved 15 adults who had normalized acts so depraved that court transcripts are still difficult to read today. Before we go deeper, you need to understand something. This isn't sensationalism. This isn't fiction. Every detail comes directly from court records, police testimonies, and documented evidence. It happened. It was real, and 13 children survived to tell what was done to them. This is the story of the Goler Clan, and I'm still trying to understand how an entire community looked the other way for so long. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button. South Mountain in Nova Scotia looks like postcard material. Rolling hills, apple orchards, quaint little towns. Tourists love it. But there's one road locals avoid. Deep Hollow Road. A dirt path winding up the mountain, leading to a place that existed outside normal society for over a century. The Goler family made their home there. When I say home, understand I'm using that term loosely. What they endured was closer to survival than living. Go back to 1860. A man arrives in Nova Scotia, poor, illiterate, searching for land nobody else wanted. South Mountain offered exactly that. Cheap, remote, ideal for someone who preferred neighbors didn't ask questions. He constructed a rough cabin, married a local woman, and they produced children. Many children. Isolation became the problem. When those kids matured, they never descended the mountain. Cousins married cousins. The next generation repeated the pattern. By the 1970s, over a century later, the Goler Clan had grown to about 40 people living in and around that property. Multiple generations, all blood-related, all cut off from the world. The consequences of that seclusion were devastating. The inbreeding showed physical deformities, severe intellectual disabilities. Most couldn't read or write. That's just what you could see. The real nightmare lay in what that isolation permitted to happen in the shadows. Picture the house where kids lived. Picture the house where kids lived. Erase whatever image house conjures in your mind. The house? I can barely force myself to describe it. No running water, no electricity, rotting floors with holes you could fall through, mattresses thrown on the ground, 5 or 6 people crammed on each one. Furniture? Car seats ripped from junked vehicles. The smell hit police from outside. One officer who'd been in law enforcement 20 years said it was the worst thing he'd ever encountered. He stepped out twice just to keep from vomiting. Rotting food, human waste, mold, decades of filth. That's where children lived. This was home for 13 children. Not a horror movie set designed to shock. Not some abandoned building used for atmospheric photos. This was where kids opened their eyes every morning, where they ate whatever scraps existed, where they tried to sleep at night, where they attempted to survive. By the 1970s, a clear leader had emerged, William Goler. Born into this family in 1945, which means he grew up swimming in the same poverty, breathing the same isolation, absorbing the same dysfunction. His father's death in the early 1970s created a power vacuum. William filled it. Things deteriorated exponentially from there. In 1984, William was 39 years old. By clan standards, he possessed intelligence. He could decipher basic words. Complete sentences emerged when he spoke. Compared to his siblings and cousins, many severely intellectually disabled, William appeared almost normal. The danger? Intelligence without morality becomes a weapon. William's moral compass didn't just point the wrong direction, it didn't exist at all. Absolute authority became his. Money, whatever meager government assistance trickled in, flowed through his hands. He decided who worked where. He determined which children attended school. Everything required his approval. Questioning him wasn't an option. Fear was William's preferred management tool. An attack dog lived on the property, large and aggressive, deliberately brutalized by William to maximize its violence. Terror of this animal permeated the kid's existence. William wielded that fear like a cudgel. Disobedience. The dog's release was threatened. Sometimes threats became reality. Children scattered, screaming, desperately seeking hiding spots. Some suffered bites. Others simply carried the constant dread that it could happen any second. Imagine never feeling safe in your own home. Your brain can't rest, ever. Your nervous system stays locked in survival mode. That was their reality. William had married a woman named Hazel when she was just 16. Married implies choice. She was forced into it, really. In that community, women's choices didn't matter. They produced 3 daughters together. Sandra arrived in 1970. Donna followed in 72. Lisa came in 76. These 3 girls would spend their childhood at the absolute epicenter of hell. They weren't alone, though. Approximately 13 kids total, cousins, nephews, nieces, occupied various shacks and rooms scattered across the compound. All of them trapped. Something breaks my heart about this. Some children were permitted to attend the local elementary school. They loved it, despite being bullied mercilessly, despite other kids mocking their torn clothes, unwashed bodies, inability to read, despite teachers who sometimes wrote them off as hopeless cases. They loved school. 6 hours daily away from Deep Hollow Road felt like paradise. One teacher in particular noticed the Goler children's constant hunger, how their eyes tracked other kids' lunches, how they devoured food during recess with frightening speed, as if expecting it to vanish. This teacher started quietly covering their meal costs. No fanfare, no requests for recognition. He simply ensured that at minimum once daily, those kids had hot food. I wish I knew his name so I could honor him here. Because that man saved lives just by being decent. For them, that meal transcended nutrition. It proved not all adults were cruel. It demonstrated kindness existed somewhere beyond their mountain. Then the school bus would return them to Deep Hollow Road. The nightmare resumed. Violence saturated daily life. Random and constant. William and the other adult men beat children for any perceived infraction. A wrong glance, an imperfectly completed task, a response deemed insolent. Kids regularly arrived at school displaying visible bruises, split lips, black eyes swollen shut. Teachers mostly did nothing. They were Golers, after all. What could anyone expect? William had developed a signature punishment. I'm warning you, this gets disturbing. He'd drag a child to one of the rusted cars littering the yard. He'd order them to place their hands in the trunk opening. Then he'd slam the lid down with brutal force on those small fingers. The sound was sickening. Bone cracking, followed immediately by screams. Some children suffered broken fingers. Others developed deep bruising under their nails that lingered for weeks. William called this educational. A lesson in obedience, he claimed. Call it what it actually is. Torture. A grown man torturing kids. Nobody stopped him. Another incident haunts me. William took Sandra, his eldest daughter, and shoved her into the narrow gap between the wood stove and the wall. The stove was burning. Heat radiated intensely. Sandra was trapped there, immobile, feeling her skin blister and hair singe. William left her wedged in that space until consciousness abandoned her. When he finally extracted her body, Sandra had sustained second-degree burns and lost patches of hair. Nobody took her to a hospital. Nobody properly treated her injuries. I stopped writing when I first encountered that detail in the court transcripts. I have a daughter. The level of evil required to torture your own child like that. I genuinely cannot process it. My brain refuses to make sense of it. But there's something even more horrifying I need to tell you about. Something that demonstrates this evil stretched back generations, not just years. Deep in the property, somewhere between the house and where the forest reclaims everything, evidence suggests babies are buried. Unmarked graves. No headstones. No records. See, the inbreeding didn't just cause developmental disabilities in those who survived. Some babies were born with deformities so severe they lived only days, sometimes hours. Others arrived stillborn, their bodies already given up. These infants were never officially registered. No birth certificates documented their brief existence. Death certificates didn't exist for them either. They simply disappeared into the mountain. Court documents reference at least 3 documented infant deaths in the Goler family over the decades. Investigators believe the actual number is significantly higher, possibly dozens. Nobody knows for certain because nobody kept records. Nobody cared enough to count. Picture that. Generations of babies born from incestuous relationships, condemned before drawing their first breath. Buried somewhere on that mountain in unmarked graves. Without names, without mourning, without anyone to remember they existed. Another layer of horror in a family constructed on buried secrets. When I discovered this detail, I had to close my laptop and walk away. These weren't just crimes happening to the 13 children who survived to tell their stories. This was a multi-generational nightmare, with victims we can't even identify because they were erased from existence before they had a chance to cry out. This was life on South Mountain, day bleeding into day, year into year, generation into generation. The world deliberately looked away, until 1979 when someone arrived who would make everything exponentially worse. 1979 changed everything. Hazel, William's wife, chose to undergo a tubal ligation surgery. 3 daughters felt like more than enough. The procedure required several days of hospitalization. William remained at home with his daughters and the rest of the family. During those days, he encountered Wanda Winston. 20 years old at the time, Wanda emerged from another mountain family equally marginalized and dysfunctional. Violence and neglect had scarred her own childhood. At 18, she'd fled home. Brief work as a waitress followed. At 19, she married an abusive man. That marriage collapsed after 8 months. When William's path crossed hers, Wanda was vulnerable, directionless, desperate. He offered her employment as a nanny and housekeeper during Hazel's hospital stay. She accepted. From day one, her real purpose became obvious. The house remained filthy. The kids, neglected. What Wanda actually did was share William's mattress. Hazel returned from the hospital expecting Wanda's departure. William had different plans. He informed his wife that Wanda would stay. Hazel would accept it or face consequences. From then on, 3 people crammed onto the same filthy mattress on the floor. Night after night, Hazel was forced to witness William and Wanda together. Can you imagine? Your husband forces his mistress into your bed. When you protest, you're beaten. Hazel attempted escape several times. She always returned. No money, nowhere to go. Her daughters remained trapped in that house. Finally, 1980 brought Hazel's breaking point. She demanded William choose, her or Wanda. William laughed in her face. He'd choose nothing. She could stay and accept reality, or leave. Hazel left. She secured a small apartment in the valley and immediately filed for custody of her daughters. She went to court armed with evidence of extreme poverty and documented violence. When the judge analyzed the case, he determined the girls would fare better with their father. William had a house. Government benefits flowed to him. The girls attended school regularly. Hazel appeared unstable, lacking resources. The judge awarded custody to William. Sandra, Donna, and Lisa would remain at Deep Hollow Road. I want you to grasp what that means. A mother escapes hell. She fights for her daughters. She presents evidence. The system examines a man with a house and declares, good enough. That judge signed their death warrant. He just didn't know it yet. Hazel would spend the rest of her life carrying the guilt of that moment, even though it wasn't her fault. She tried. The system failed her. Years later, after everything came out, Hazel would tell reporters she still had nightmares about that courtroom, about the moment the judge said her daughters were staying with William. With Hazel removed from the equation, Wanda assumed a central role. She carried an old, worn rag doll everywhere. Frayed yarn formed the hair. A dirty dress hung on its body. One button eye was missing. She constantly conversed with this doll, seeking its opinion on decisions, announcing punishments through it using alternating voices, her own high-pitched and childlike, then a deeper voice supposedly belonging to the doll. I wish I were inventing this. Court testimony confirmed it. Police reports documented it. Multiple witnesses verified it. This happened. Children learned to fear the doll as much as Wanda herself. When Wanda clutched the doll close to her face and began speaking to it, something terrible was about to unfold. She also manipulated William through intimacy. Keep him satisfied, and he'd execute any command she issued. If a child contradicted Wanda, she didn't need to dirty her hands. A gesture, a word. William handled the punishment. Quick learning curve. The children feared Wanda more than William. With William, at least warning signs existed. His face flushed red. His voice escalated. Visible indicators appeared. Wanda operated differently. Her face remained placid. Her voice stayed soft and childlike. She smiled while orchestrating violence. She'd hold her doll and whisper to it, then something horrific would happen. That unpredictability proved more terrifying than William's obvious rage. 1980 also marked when the clan's true nature fully revealed itself. Sandra had reached 10 years old. Donna was 8. Lisa just 4. All three existed surrounded by cousins, uncles, aunts. Roughly 13 children occupied the property during that period. The 15 adults had established a culture where kids existed to serve. They performed household labor. Food deprivation served as punishment. Beatings followed minimal infractions. Physical violence wasn't even the worst part. I'm choosing my words carefully here, because this is where the case becomes nearly impossible to discuss. It needs to be said, though. It needs to be remembered. Forgetting is exactly how this happens again. Children in the Goler clan were viewed as property in multiple senses. Charles Goler, the patriarch, was over 60 years old. He was raping his own daughters, 2 of them. Both became pregnant by him. The babies born existed as children and grandchildren simultaneously, genetically impossible to untangle. An uncle forced his teenage niece into similar circumstances. When she gave birth, the grandmother took the baby and raised it as if it were the mother's sibling. These situations defied any moral logic, yet in the Goler clan they were normalized. Then there's what happened to the youngest members. William Goler, as clan leader, believed he possessed the right to do whatever he wanted. Donna, the middle daughter, would later recall the precise moment her childhood ended. She was very young. It should have been a happy day. She'd come home excited about starting school. That afternoon, her father crossed a line that should never be crossed. From there, it became routine, nearly daily. No escape existed. Sandra, the oldest, endured the same. Eventually, even the youngest was included in this nightmare. I can barely force myself to type this. I've been researching this case for months. This part still makes me physically ill. William wasn't alone in this. All the adult men in the clan participated. His brothers Henry and Cranswick, his brothers-in-law Roy, Lawrence, and Eugene. Cranswick was the most violent. He laughed during the acts. He bragged openly afterward. Not a trace of remorse or shame showed on his face. Cecil, William's paralyzed brother, couldn't physically participate. William found a role for him anyway. When these acts occurred, Cecil would be wheeled to the location in his wheelchair. Someone positioned him where he had a clear view. Cecil watched, producing guttural sounds that seemed like approval, spasmodic hand movements, expressions that resembled pleasure. He couldn't touch, but he consumed the horror visually. For the kids, Cecil's presence added another layer of trauma. It transformed everything into a performance with an audience. Let that sink in. These weren't crimes of passion or momentary control loss. They were performances with an audience, scheduled, routine. That's not just evil. That's a level of depravity I genuinely cannot comprehend. The women knew, all of them. Some actively helped. Wanda's arrival made everything exponentially worse. She didn't just tolerate what was happening, she committed atrocities personally, with a frequency and sadism that shocked even within the clan's already horrific context. Sandra became her first victim. Wanda would drag her to the bedroom and commit unspeakable acts. Then she'd force the others to watch, a form of intimidation and normalization. Donna came next. Then the cousins, Pam, Sally, Annie, all victimized in similar ways. Then the youngest daughter, a small child who had barely learned to speak in complete sentences, who still needed help getting dressed, who played with dolls and believed in fairy tales. She too became a victim. I need to stop here briefly. I'm looking at court transcripts describing what happened to a child who should have been in kindergarten, learning her ABCs, playing with friends. Instead, she existed in hell. Wanda also targeted the boys. Doug, Matt, Michael, Jeff, none were spared. No distinction existed. No mercy. She used objects as weapons. Threats flowed constantly. She beat children with pieces of bicycle tire when they disobeyed. Sadistic punishments were invented. Most disturbing, Wanda invited the family men to watch while she acted. She transformed these horrors into spectacles. William was an enthusiastic viewer. Sometimes he participated alongside her. Yet another layer of sadism existed, and this one is particularly devastating. The adults weren't satisfied being the only perpetrators. They forced the children themselves to become instruments of harm against each other. Older boys, 12 or 13 years old, were coerced into hurting younger girls. Not by their own will, under severe threats from William and the other men. Refuse? You'd be beaten. Or worse, the dog would be released. So they obeyed. They carried that guilt for the rest of their lives. Teenage cousins were forced to participate in acts with younger cousins while adults watched and gave instructions. The older ones wept while doing it. The younger ones couldn't understand why those who should protect them were causing harm instead. William knew exactly what he was doing. Turn victims into perpetrators. Make sure every kid felt guilty. Destroy any chance they'd trust each other. Thus, they eliminated any possibility of solidarity among the children. How do you trust someone who also hurt you? Even if that person was forced. Even if they're also a victim. Complete imprisonment. Each child isolated in their particular hell. This is what trauma accomplishes. It doesn't just hurt you. It makes you hurt others. Then you carry that shame forever, despite it not being your fault. The clan's internal horror wasn't the limit, though. William discovered how to profit from the children's suffering. He began inviting men from outside, neighbors, occasional acquaintances, strangers who crossed his path, to the property. The process was systematic and repugnant. William would gather the children. He made them stand in a line, side by side against the wall. They were dirty, terrified, knowing what was coming. Then the visitor would enter. He'd examine the line as if selecting merchandise from a shelf. He'd point to one. William would hand them over. What was the payment for this? What value did William Goler place on a child's dignity and safety? A pack of cigarettes, sometimes a bottle of beer, occasionally some crumpled dollars. I had to stop writing when I read that in the court transcripts. A pack of cigarettes, less than $3, less than the cost of a sandwich. That's what he valued a human child at. I still can't process that level of evil. How does a human brain justify that? How do you look at a terrified child and think, yes, a pack of Marlboros is fair payment? It wasn't organized trafficking. It wasn't a sophisticated criminal network. It was a man on a mountain, so morally bankrupt, so completely disconnected from basic humanity, that he viewed children as currency for his most banal vices. They were treated as less than merchandise, disposable commodities, objects. Worst part, this didn't happen hidden. Other family adults knew. They witnessed it. Nobody intervened. William also invented psychological games. One became routine, the mailbox game. In the morning, William would gather all children in the yard. He'd point to the mailbox at the end of the long driveway. Then, he'd announce the rules. Whoever reached the box first would be free from physical punishment for that day. They ran. They stumbled in tall grass. They shoved each other, desperate to win. The winner received their prize, a day of relative peace. The losers knew what awaited them. Children running desperately, pushing each other, because the prize was just not being tortured that day, not safety, not love, just the absence of violence for 24 hours. That was the best they could hope for. I don't know how to process that. The best day of your life is when you're not tortured. That's not childhood. That's hell. Some attempted to ask for help. Sandra ran away from home twice. Police found her both times. She tried to tell what was happening. Officers took her back without investigating anything. Donna told a teacher. Instead of contacting authorities, the teacher called William to clarify the situation. William denied everything, claiming his daughter had mental problems. The teacher believed him. The children were systematically ignored because they were Golers. Nobody wanted involvement with the Golers. But silence doesn't last forever. January 1984 arrived at South Mountain like any other winter. Heavy snow blanketed the roads. Cutting wind swept across the slopes. Inside the Goler house, life continued its dark, predictable rhythm. Sandra was now 14. 14 years marked by uninterrupted suffering. 14 years witnessing and enduring horrors no child should know. Something in Sandra was changing, though. Maybe her age. Maybe the school, which remained her only contact with a different world. Maybe simply the limit of what a human being can endure. Wednesday, January 18th, 1984. Sandra arrived at school as usual. She attended her classes. She ate lunch in the cafeteria. Everything appeared normal. During the afternoon break, though, Sandra went to the girls' bathroom. There, alone, she started to cry. Not a quiet cry. A desperate, uncontrollable sob that seemed to tear itself from her chest. A teacher heard the sound. She entered the bathroom and discovered Sandra sitting on the floor, back pressed against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, crying so hard breathing became difficult. The teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had taught the Goler children for years. She knew they came from a difficult home. She understood the poverty, the neglect, but she'd never witnessed Sandra like this. Completely shattered. Mrs. Patterson sat on the floor beside Sandra. She didn't immediately ask questions. She just waited. Eventually, Sandra began to speak, at first in disjointed fragments, then in sentences, then in a torrent of words that seemed to have been dammed up for years. She told everything. The violence, the hunger, the isolation, what the adults did, all of them involved. The names, the frequency, the details. Everything poured out. Mrs. Patterson listened in absolute horror. When Sandra finished, a long silence stretched between them. Then Mrs. Patterson said something that changed everything. She said, "I believe you, and I'm going to help you." That might seem small. 3 simple words, I believe you. For Sandra, though, who had been ignored by police, dismissed by teachers, overlooked by every adult who should have protected her, those words were revolutionary. Someone finally believed her. Someone was finally going to act. Mrs. Patterson immediately brought Sandra to the principal's office. The principal summoned the school counselor. Together they contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Within hours, 2 officers arrived at the school. They interviewed Sandra in a private room. She repeated her story, every horrible detail. The officers took extensive notes. They asked clarifying questions. At the end, they assured her this would not be ignored. Action would be taken. Here's what terrifies me about this. Mrs. Patterson's choice to listen, to believe, to refuse to let it go. That's what made the difference. Not the system, not mandatory reporting laws. One teacher who decided protecting a child mattered more than avoiding uncomfortable situations. How many other children, in how many other situations, are ignored simply because adults don't want to deal with intervention's complexity? How many Sandras are still waiting for someone to say, I believe you. The police wasted no time. That same afternoon, they assembled a team. This case couldn't be investigated slowly. The children faced immediate danger. Every day of delay meant another day of suffering. They needed to move fast. By evening on January 18th, a plan existed. Next morning, they'd go to South Mountain. January 19th, 1984. 6 police vehicles drove up Deep Hollow Road with 12 officers, social workers, and a nurse who specialized in treating traumatized kids inside. They knew what they were heading into. Sandra's testimony had prepared them. Descriptions of the house, the people, the property layout existed. Nothing could have fully prepared them for what they found, though. The house exceeded the descriptions. The smell assaulted them from outside. One officer later told reporters he'd been in law enforcement for 20 years and had never encountered anything that bad. He stepped out twice just to keep from vomiting. That's where children lived. When officers entered, several others had to retreat to catch their breath. The children were there, dirty, scared, confused. Some attempted to run. Others just stared with blank expressions. The adults were belligerent. William demanded to know what authority police had to enter his property. He claimed it was a misunderstanding. His daughter was mentally unstable. She lied constantly. Police weren't leaving without those children. One by one, they gathered them. 13 children total, ages ranging from 4 to 15. They wrapped them in blankets. They carried the youngest ones. They led them to the vehicles. The children didn't understand what was happening. Some cried. Others seemed relieved. A few asked if they were going to jail. Children so broken they thought they were being arrested. That's what years of abuse does. It flips everything. Makes you think you're the bad guy. That breaks my heart more than almost anything else in this case. They were being rescued and thought they were being punished. Because that's all they'd ever known. Officers transported the children directly to the Valley Hospital. Medical teams were waiting there. Doctors examined each child. The injuries they found told the whole story. Years of abuse, malnutrition, trauma, everything documented. The medical reports would later become crucial evidence in court. In that moment, though, the priority was simply ensuring the children were safe, fed, and medically stable. Meanwhile, back at Deep Hollow Road, police began a comprehensive property search. Every room was photographed. Evidence was collected. The adults were interviewed separately. Slowly, the full scope of the horror became clear. This wasn't just one perpetrator. It was a system, a culture. 15 adults, all complicit, all involved in various degrees. The investigation kept growing. Police interviewed the children individually, with trained psychologists and social workers present. The children's testimonies were consistent, detailed, devastating. They corroborated each other's accounts. They named specific perpetrators. They described specific incidents. Donna, Sandra's younger sister, 12 at the time, gave testimony that left investigators in tears. She described years of systematic victimization. She named her father, her uncle, Wanda, and others. She spoke like it happened to someone else. Her brain couldn't process that it happened to her. The youngest victims, some only 4 or 5, struggled to articulate what had happened. Their behavior spoke volumes. Though, they flinched when adults approached. They hoarded food. They refused to sleep alone. They exhibited sexualized behavior completely inappropriate for their age. All classic signs of severe trauma. By January's end, police had sufficient evidence to press charges. February 2nd, 1984, 15 adults were arrested simultaneously. William, Wanda, his brothers-in-law, the women who'd helped, all of them, over 200 charges. The youngest victim was 4 years old. 4. The crimes had been happening for at least 5 years, probably much longer. The arrests dominated headlines across Canada. South Mountain, the Goler Clan, words that became synonymous with one of the worst family crime cases in Canadian history. For the children, though, the arrests were just the beginning. They'd been removed from hell. Yes, but they had no idea how to exist in the normal world. They'd been so completely isolated, so thoroughly indoctrinated into the clan's twisted logic, that basic concepts were foreign. Privacy? They didn't understand it. Personal boundaries? Unknown. Interacting with non-family members? Terrifying. They'd never been to a grocery store. They'd never watched a television show. They'd never celebrated a birthday. Foster families who took them in were shocked by how much the children didn't know. One girl, placed with a kind family in the valley, asked her foster mother if she was supposed to provide services in exchange for food. A 12-year-old child asking if she needed to prostitute herself for meals. Because that's what she'd been taught. That's what the clan had normalized. Another boy, placed in a group home, hoarded food under his bed until it rotted. When staff asked why, he said he didn't know when he'd be allowed to eat again. Despite meals being provided 3 times daily, every day, his brain couldn't accept that food would be consistently available. Trauma had rewired his survival instincts so completely that safety felt like a trick. Sandra, the girl who broke the silence, struggled immensely with guilt. She felt responsible for destroying the family, even though the family had destroyed her first, even though she'd saved her siblings and cousins. The psychological chains were so strong that freedom felt like betrayal. This is what abusers do. They make you believe exposing the truth is the real crime, that protecting yourself is selfish, that your suffering matters less than keeping secrets. Sandra would spend years in therapy trying to untangle that programming, trying to accept she did the right thing, that she was brave, not traitorous. The guilt lingered, though. Decades later, she would still struggle with it. The case also revealed massive systemic failures. How had this continued for so long? How had a community known about the Golers, known they were isolated and strange and possibly dangerous, and done nothing? Teachers had seen the bruises, doctors had treated injuries, neighbors had heard screams. Social workers had visited the property briefly years earlier and filed reports noting concerns. Yet nothing substantial had been done, nothing that would have stopped the horror. Reasons existed, of course. The Golers were viewed as unreachable, too far gone, too damaged by poverty and inbreeding. Interventions seemed pointless. Fear also played a role. William was known to be violent. The property was isolated. Going up that mountain felt dangerous, so people looked away. They told themselves it wasn't their problem. They hoped someone else would handle it. The children suffered because of that collective cowardice. Following the arrests, the government launched an internal review. They wanted to understand how the system had failed so catastrophically. The findings were damning. Multiple opportunities to intervene had been missed. Warning signs had been dismissed. Reports had been filed and forgotten. The review concluded that a combination of rural isolation, systemic poverty, prejudice against the family, and bureaucratic inefficiency had created a perfect storm of neglect. Recommendations were made. Policies were changed. Training was mandated. For the 13 children of the Goler Clan, though, those changes came too late. Their childhoods were gone. Their innocence destroyed. No policy reform could give that back. The trial started in fall 1984, Nova Scotia Supreme Court. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Journalists from across Canada attended. National news. The public demanded answers. They wanted justice. They wanted to understand how something this evil could unfold in a modern country. The prosecution had everything. 13 child victims willing to testify, medical evidence documenting years of harm, photographs of that hellhole they called home, testimony after testimony from police, social workers, doctors, all saying the same thing. These children were telling the truth. Most powerfully, though, the children themselves took the stand. Several of the older ones testified. Sandra, now 15, approached the witness stand, terrified, facing the adults who had tormented her entire life. She spoke anyway. She told the truth. She didn't waver once. The defense attempted to discredit her. They suggested fabrication, mental instability, a story invented out of anger toward her father. The consistency of testimonies from multiple children dismantled that argument, though. You can't coach 13 children, all with varying intellectual abilities, to tell identical lies in perfect detail. Impossible. The adults, when they testified, displayed no genuine remorse. William claimed he'd done nothing wrong. What happened in his house was his business. The government had no right to interfere with his family. Wanda claimed coercion by William. She was also a victim, she insisted. The children's testimonies contradicted that entirely. They described Wanda as an active, enthusiastic participant. In some cases, the primary perpetrator. Cranswick, the most violent uncle, refused to testify. He sat in the courtroom with a smirk plastered on his face, as if the entire proceeding was entertainment. Even when child victims described what he'd done to them, no emotion showed, no shame, no regret, nothing. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, guilty verdicts rang out on almost all counts. All 15 adults were convicted. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others wept. The children, present for the verdict, didn't know how to react. They'd spent their entire lives being told family loyalty was the highest value. Outsiders were the enemy. Now those outsiders had delivered justice. Sentencing came several weeks later. This is where the story takes a turn that still infuriates me to this day. The sentences were absurdly light. William Goler, the ringleader, the man who orchestrated years of systematic torture, received 7 years in prison. 7 years. For crimes spanning at least 5 years involving multiple children documented in excruciating detail. Let me break this down for you. 7 years in prison. With good behavior, he'd serve less than 5. Less than 1 year for each year of crimes. Less time than the horror lasted. How is that justice? Wanda Winston, who victimized 8 children over 5 consecutive years, received 4 years. 4 years. She spent less time in prison than she spent committing the crimes. Her punishment was shorter than her crime spree. How is that justice? Cranswick Goler, the most violent, the one who laughed while hurting children, received 5 years. Henry Goler got 3. The women who helped hold children down, who enabled and participated, most received sentences between 1 and 3 years. The women got even less. One woman, 6 months for holding children down while they were raped. 6 months. That's less time than most people spend planning a wedding. The judge's reasoning? These were people of low intelligence, limited education, and severe poverty. They didn't fully understand the severity of their actions. Prison would be particularly hard on them given their disabilities. Rehabilitation, not punishment, should be the focus. I understand the theory behind rehabilitative justice, I genuinely do. But there's a point where intelligence doesn't matter, where poverty doesn't excuse the inexcusable, where disability doesn't justify the unjustifiable. These adults knew children were suffering. They heard the screams, they saw the tears, they watched children beg for it to stop. They continued anyway. That's not a failure of understanding, that's a choice. The other thing that enrages me, the children, the victims, received no such consideration. Nobody said these children have low intelligence and deserve extra support. Nobody said these children grew up in poverty and deserve the best possible resources for recovery. The children were treated as evidence, as case numbers, as problems to be managed by an already overburdened social services system. Meanwhile, their abusers were treated with kid gloves, given lenient sentences, provided with programs and support in prison. When they were released, most returned to the same community, the same valley, the same region where their victims were attempting to rebuild shattered lives. The prosecution appealed, arguing the sentences were grossly inadequate given the severity and duration of what had been done. The appeals court agreed the sentences were light. Legal precedents, they said, judge's discretion. The sentences stood. By 1990, less than 6 years after the arrests, most of the convicted adults walked free. They'd served their time. They'd, in the eyes of the law, paid their debt to society. They returned to their lives. Meanwhile, the children they destroyed were still in therapy, still struggling with nightmares, still trying to understand how to function in the world. Sandra would later describe the trial as almost as traumatic as what she'd endured, having to recount every detail in a public courtroom, being cross-examined by defense attorneys who tried to paint her as a liar, watching the adults show no remorse, then seeing them receive sentences that felt like a slap in the face. She said it felt like the system was telling her what happened to her didn't really matter, that her suffering wasn't important enough to warrant real punishment. She wasn't wrong. The message sent by those sentences was clear. Harm children, especially children from marginalized families, especially in rural areas, especially when the perpetrators are themselves disadvantaged, it won't be taken seriously. You can destroy a child's life and serve less time than someone convicted of robbery. That's the reality. The Goler case did lead to some positive changes. Child protection laws in Nova Scotia were strengthened. Mandatory reporting requirements were expanded. Training for teachers and social workers was improved. The government invested more resources in rural child welfare. These were good changes, necessary changes. They didn't help the Goler children, though. They came too late. What happened to the children? That's the question I kept asking as I researched this case. After the trials, after media attention faded, after the adults served their minimal sentences and returned to society, what happened to the kids? The answer is complicated, in some cases, heartbreaking. The 13 children were placed in various foster homes and group facilities across Nova Scotia. The goal was separating them from each other, preventing them from reinforcing traumatic bonds and dysfunctional patterns they'd learned. Some placements succeeded, some were disasters. Sandra, the girl who broke the silence, struggled immensely. She was placed with a kind family in a small town about an hour from South Mountain. They tried their best. They gave her her own room, clean clothes, regular meals, therapy. Sandra couldn't adjust, though. She ran away multiple times. She got into fights at school. She engaged in self-destructive behavior. By 16, she was in a group home for troubled teens. Here's what people don't understand. You can rescue a kid from hell, give them everything, but their brain learned to expect danger everywhere. Trust no one. Wait for the next hit. That doesn't just go away because you're safe now. Sometimes it never goes away. Sandra didn't receive that level of support. She got standard, underfunded, overburdened social services support. A therapist she saw once weekly, if that. A social worker juggling a caseload of 50 other kids. A system designed to keep her fed and housed, but not to truly heal her. At 18, Sandra aged out of the foster system. She was on her own. No family support, no safety net. She got a job at a fast food restaurant. She rented a tiny apartment. She tried to build a life. The trauma followed her everywhere, though. Nightmares, difficulty with relationships, inability to trust anyone. In her early 20s, Sandra made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her story. She reached out to her father. William had been released from prison by then. He was living in a trailer on the outskirts of the valley, collecting disability benefits, largely ostracized by the community. Sandra went to see him. Why? Everyone asked that question. Why would she seek out the man who destroyed her childhood? Sandra's answer was simple and devastating. She wanted to know if he was proud of her, if he thought she'd turned out okay, if he loved her. The girl who saved those children, who destroyed his empire of horror, she still, years later, sought approval from the man who'd tormented her. That's what trauma does. It rewires your brain so completely that even freedom doesn't feel real. Even safety doesn't feel deserved. Even love from healthy people doesn't feel as important as a scrap of validation from your abuser. William looked at his daughter, the one who'd spent her entire childhood being tortured by him, the one who still somehow hoped for his love, and he called her a traitor. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I was wrong." A traitor. Because exposing the truth is betrayal to an abuser. He said she'd destroyed the family, that he'd never forgive her. Sandra walked away, finally understanding he would never be the father she deserved. Because abusers don't change. They don't suddenly develop empathy. They don't wake up one day and realize the damage they've done. Sandra struggled with addiction in her late 20s. Alcohol mostly. Self-medicating the pain therapy couldn't fully reach. She had a few relationships. None lasted. She never had children. She said she was too afraid she'd repeat the patterns, that the violence was somehow in her blood. It wasn't, of course. Trauma makes you believe things like that, though. Last I heard, Sandra's in her early 50s now. Different province. Quiet job. She doesn't talk about any of this. She doesn't do interviews. She just wants to be left alone. Honestly, I respect that. She gave everything she had to expose the truth. She doesn't owe the world anything more. Donna, the middle sister, had a different trajectory. She was placed in a more stable foster home. The family had experience with traumatized children. They were patient. They didn't expect immediate healing. They just provided consistency, safety, and love. Slowly, Donna began to stabilize. She finished high school. Then she did something remarkable. She went to community college and got a degree in social work. Yes, you read that right. Donna became a social worker. She wanted to help other children who'd been through what she'd endured. She wanted to be the person who said, "I believe you," when a child found the courage to speak. I can't imagine how triggering that work must have been for her. Every case probably brought back memories. Every child victim probably reminded her of herself, of her sisters, of her cousins. But she did it anyway, because she understood, better than anyone, what those children needed. She knew what it felt like to be ignored, to be dismissed, to be treated like a problem instead of a victim. She refused to let that happen to other kids on her watch. For over 15 years, Donna worked in child protective services in Nova Scotia. She specialized in cases involving family violence and what adults do to children behind closed doors. She became known among her colleagues as someone who never gave up on a case, who fought for kids when everyone else had written them off, who saw through the excuses and the lies that abusive parents told. Her supervisor once said in an interview that Donna had an uncanny ability to connect with traumatized children. They trusted her in a way they didn't trust other social workers. Of course they did. They could sense somehow that she understood, that she'd been where they were, that she'd survived. Donna is now in her 50s. She's married. She has 2 children, both adults now, both doing well. She broke the cycle. She created a healthy family. She proved that trauma doesn't have to be a life sentence, that with support, with therapy, with love, recovery is possible. Her story is proof that survivors can become more than what was done to them. But here's the reality. Donna is the exception, not the rule. Most of the Goler children did not have happy endings. Most struggled with addiction, homelessness, mental illness. Several ended up in abusive relationships, repeating the patterns they'd learned because that's what felt familiar, what felt like home, even though it was hell. At least 2 died young, one from an overdose, another from suicide. The youngest children, who were only 4 or 5 when they were removed, fared slightly better. They had less memory of what had been done to them. They were young enough that their brains could still be rewired with intensive early intervention. Some were adopted into loving families and went on to live relatively normal lives. Even they carry scars, though. Even they have questions about where they came from. Even they struggle with identity and belonging. Lisa, the youngest of William's daughters, was only 8 when the clan was broken up. She was placed with a family in another province, far from Nova Scotia. They changed her last name. They never told her classmates about her past. They just let her be a normal kid. For the most part, it worked. Lisa grew up, went to college, got married, had kids. She has limited memory of Deep Hollow Road. What she does remember, she's worked through in therapy. A few years ago, though, Lisa did something surprising. She started researching her family history. She wanted to understand where she came from. She tracked down some of her siblings and cousins. She attended a small private reunion. She said it was one of the hardest things she ever did, because these people were family, but they were also strangers. They shared trauma, but not life. They had a bond, but it was a bond forged in hell. She told a friend afterward that seeing them was like looking into a mirror that showed her what she could have become. Some of her siblings were thriving, others were barely surviving. The difference, she realized, was mostly luck. She'd gotten placed with a good family. Others hadn't. Some of the children maintain contact with each other. They have a private online group where they share updates, offer support, remember the siblings who didn't make it. It's a community built on shared survival. They understand each other in a way no one else ever will. It's also painful, though. Every interaction is a reminder of what was lost. What about the adults? What happened after they were released from prison? William Goler lived until 2001. He died of a heart attack at age 56. He never apologized, never expressed remorse. He spent his final years in that trailer, mostly alone, largely avoided by everyone. When he died, only a handful of people attended his funeral. None of his children came. Wanda Winston was released in 1988 after serving her 4-year sentence. She moved to another province. There's no public record of her after that. She changed her name, presumably to escape her past. Some reports suggest she died in the early 2000s, but there's no confirmation. Cranswick Goler, the most violent uncle, was released in 1989. He returned to the valley. He lived in a small cabin on the edge of town. In 1995, he was arrested again, this time for assaulting a neighbor. He served another year. He died in 2003 from liver failure, likely related to alcoholism. He was 58. Most of the other adults lived quiet, isolated lives after release. Some died young from health complications related to years of poverty and neglect. A few are still alive, in their 70s and 80s now, living in nursing homes or assisted care facilities. They are by all accounts forgotten. The world moved on. The property on Deep Hollow Road was eventually seized by the government for unpaid taxes. The house was torn down in the late 1990s. The land was sold to a developer who built a few modest homes there. The new residents have no idea what happened on that land. They just know it's quiet and affordable. There's no memorial, no plaque, no marker indicating that 13 children were tortured there for years. The only evidence the Goler Clan ever existed is in court records, old newspaper articles, and the memories of those who survived. That's what haunts me most about this case. How easily it could be forgotten. How quickly society moved on. The trials were big news in 1984. By 1985, media had moved to other stories. By 1990, most people had forgotten the name Goler. By 2000, it was a footnote in Canadian crime history. For the children, though, it's not history. It's not a footnote. It's their life. It's what they think about every day. It's why they flinch when someone raises their voice. It's why they struggle to trust. It's why they have nightmares 30 years later. I spoke to a trauma therapist while researching this case. She told me something that stuck with me. She said trauma doesn't fade with time the way people think it does. What changes is your ability to cope with it. Some people develop healthy coping mechanisms, some don't. But the wound itself never fully heals. It just becomes a part of who you are. The Goler children carry that wound. Some carry it better than others. Some, like Donna, have built beautiful lives despite it. Others were crushed by it. All of them, every single one, deserved better. They deserved adults who protected them. They deserved a system that believed them. They deserved justice that actually meant something. They didn't get that. And that's the real tragedy of South Mountain. Why am I telling you this story? Why dig up something this painful, this dark, this uncomfortable? Because forgetting is dangerous. Silence is what allowed the Goler Clan to exist for over a century. Looking away is how children suffer while the world goes about its business. The Goler case isn't an anomaly. It's not some bizarre outlier that could never happen again. It's a warning. It's proof that when we ignore poverty, when we dismiss rural communities, when we stigmatize certain families as too damaged to help, we create spaces where evil thrives unchecked. Children are living in situations similar to what the Goler children endured right now. Today, Maybe not as extreme, maybe not as isolated, but suffering nonetheless. They're not being helped because the adults around them are looking away. Because intervention is complicated. Because it's easier to assume someone else will handle it. Sandra broke the silence because one teacher chose to listen. One person chose to believe her. One adult decided that protecting a child was worth the discomfort of getting involved. That's all it took. One person. Here's what I want you to take from this story. If a child tells you they're being hurt, believe them. If you see signs of harm, report it. If you have the opportunity to intervene, take it. Don't assume someone else will. Don't convince yourself it's not your place. Don't tell yourself it's probably fine, because it's probably not fine. Your action, your willingness to be uncomfortable for someone else's safety, could be the difference between a child suffering for years and a child being saved. The children of the Goler Clan didn't have that. They had adults who looked away, who made excuses, who prioritized their own comfort over children's safety. 13 kids paid the price. We can do better. We have to do better. Small actions matter. One teacher changed everything for Sandra. You could be that person for someone else. The legacy of South Mountain doesn't have to be just horror. It can also be a reminder, a call to action, a demand that we do better. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to a story that's hard to hear. If you found this video important, please share it. Not for views, but because stories like this need to be remembered. Silence protects abusers. Truth protects children. Take care of yourselves.